Honored guests, please join me in welcoming our final panel of the day, Shadow Forces, the growing threat of non-state actors in cybersecurity and information warfare, moderated by Mr. Patrick Tucker, Technology and Science Editor of Defense One. He will be joined by His Excellency Abdulrahman Ali Mohammed Al-Farahid Al-Malki, President of National Cyber Security Agency of the State of Qatar. Ms. Anjana Rajan, former Assistant National Cyber Director at the White House. Dr. Marc Owen Jones, Associate Professor of Media Analytics at Northwestern University in Qatar. And Mr. Adam Hadley, Founder and Executive Director of Tech Against Terrorism.
Great. Thank you all for sticking around. Wonderful to see you all here. Last panel of the day. I think that this is going to be the best panel because we are talking about something that's so important. What a wonderful group of guests that I have here today. And non-state actors in cybersecurity, the roles that they are playing now much larger than just a few years ago. Every day I cover more and more non-state actors that perhaps they have a state affiliation connected to them, but it is a booming area, a massive concern, and it's one that in so many ways defies conventional approaches to cybersecurity and to security in general, as well as investigation. So I'll start with you, Your Excellency. In terms of the trends right now that you are seeing, from non-state cyber actors, what are the most significant that you perceive right now, and how would you characterize the growth of this group over the last 5 years?
Thank you very much. Actually, the most important thing that we are noticing now is the time of the attack itself. It is taking very, very short time to start an attack and implement it, and that's making a load on the defense that they couldn't follow up with them. The other thing is the attacker are not any longer using the malware, the known tools. They are using the tools which is inside the attacked machine. So it will be very difficult to analyze and discover where is the attack. And the statistic mentioned that in 2024, more than 79% of the attack without using any known tools. Maybe the third one is the increased use of the cyber crime as a service. So now there is a lot of groups are doing it as a service. So any beginner attacker, it is very easy for him to start any attack using these services. So the cyber security as a service is a very known trend in this time.
That sort of speaks to something that we heard from one of the earlier panels, the new sort of mercantile aspect to non-state actors. We've sort of always associated them with groups that were animating from a particular spiritual perspective or working through some sort of animus, and yet now we see the rise of basically for-profit entities and even groups that we've long associated with being sort of spiritual extremists who are willing to commit violence for the sake of a cause, turning to for-profit activity. And that is becoming the new norm as we watch a global security framework come under tremendous pressure as alliances dynamically reimagine themselves. So I want to turn to you, Anjana, and talk a little bit about what you saw from that perspective. There we go. What you saw from that perspective during the Biden presidency and where you see that trend going now, and then we'll get into a little bit of the solution space.
Great. Well, first I want to say thank you to our hosts, the Soufan Center and the State of Qatar, for hosting us. You're right, I just finished my tour of service in government and was formerly the Assistant National Cyber Director at the White House for President Biden. Just to set the stage a bit about how we thought about cyber, our office was probably best known for authoring the President's National Cybersecurity Strategy. And the strategy outlined two key strategic shifts. The first shift was recognizing that we need to rebalance the responsibility to defend cyberspace to those who can actually bear it. And we often are relying on state and local governments, small businesses to defend against cyber attacks from nation states, and that's simply not tenable. And so instead we must ask those who can defend all of us, including the private sector and the federal government, to take on their share of this mission. And the second shift was really creating long-term incentives for strategic investments in cybersecurity that think long-term and not just putting a Band-Aid on the immediate pain. And we've long seen that malicious actors have taken advantage of market forces to drive cyber attacks, and we need to do the same for cyber defense.
Yes.
And the strategy was written with the idea that it would be an enduring strategy for the decisive decade ahead, regardless of the administration that is in power. And because of that, it had to be adaptable to a changing landscape, and that means shifts in technologies, whether it be emerging technologies like AI or quantum computing, but also shifts in adversarial threat actors. And so, today we're here to talk about non-state actors, and I think what you're now noticing is that you're getting a much more fragmented, diversified group. And so if we're going to defend cyberspace, we have to be somewhat agnostic to a particular adversary and really think about what does it mean to build secure and resilient systems for the long haul.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important point. For years covering Russian active measures, particularly as they were targeting different governments around the world, you noticed a trend where basically a lot of Russian or Eastern European speaking cyber actors, they were sort of like privateers in the old days. So there were pirates, but you could also be a pirate with a letter of marque, and then you were a privateer, where you could just pirate specific ships, and the government would be kind of okay with that. And different governments would basically coerce groups that were working within their confines, like Russia would, and say, you can hack or do any ransomware attack you want on an outside target if it's in the United States, but at some point the FSB will come and knock on the door and you'll be working for us, whether you like that or not, and that's how you sort of get co-opted into it, and a lot of the 2016 hacks were sort of related to that. So I want to turn to you, Adam, and talk a little bit in an escalating hybrid threat environment where there are terrorists and nation states influencing each other more and more. How do you see, to go back to that 2016 question, how do you see disinformation as a threat vector? This is also something that we associate now with sort of state groups, but it's a really chaotic environment right now, and one that's sort of core to how we understand what our governments are doing to civil rest or strife. How do you see these different non-state actors interacting with state actors in terms of disinformation? And how is the rise of non-state cyber actors affecting the disinformation environment?
Well, thank you very much. And firstly, thanks to the Soufan Center and the State of Qatar for the invitation to attend today. At Tech Against Terrorism, we mainly focus on understanding and disrupting the terrorist use of the internet. But what we found over the past few years is, to use your word, increased chaos. There's a significant amount of cognitive dissonance, I think, in the counterterrorism community at present, because I think it's fair to say the adversarial use of the internet by terrorist organizations and hostile nation states is so significant and grave, and yet the investment in understanding and disrupting this is surprisingly minimal. In terms of the specifics of how terrorists might be using disinformation in nation states also, I think our observation is the strategic purpose of many, if not all, terrorist organizations is to undermine society, is to undermine trust and confidence in governments globally. And that's also the case with some hostile nation states. So whilst we haven't seen a significant amount of evidence to show this overlap, it stands to reason that there are shared objectives. But what I would say, when talking about the information environment, disinformation is an important topic, but so is the normal sharing of terrorist content.
Yes.
Actually, would you believe that obvious examples of terrorist content produced by Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the Houthis, it's so abundant online, and in many senses, large platforms are now doing less than ever before to remove this material. So the disinformation concerns that many have are entirely understandable. But what we would also say is that terrorists are using more conventional methods to share their propaganda, to recruit people, and to promote support for their ideals.
Yeah. So I want to turn to you, Marc, because that sort of speaks to something that you track very closely. And in looking at these disinformation campaigns, I think it brings to light some serious questions about social media and not just the vulnerability that has always existed, but that now seems to be growing. It's also like becoming a feature, depending on the ownership of any particular social media outfit. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, the vulnerability of social media and our dialogue to not just increased disinformation from state actors, but now increasingly from any actor, from non-state actors as well.
Yeah, thank you, and it's great to be here again. Thank you to the Soufan Center for the invitation. Yeah, so I want to echo again what Adam said. But firstly, when we talk about non-state actors, I think we need to think of disinformation. Just to re-emphasize, this is a cybersecurity threat, right? Some call it cognitive hacking. I don't like that term. But we have to think of deception supply chains or disinformation supply chains. When we see a disinformation campaign or an influence operation, whatever you want to call it, there's often a chain of actors involved. Obviously, sometimes there's a paying customer, and then there's an entity that uses specific techniques on specific platforms to target a specific entity. This is not necessarily new, it's just a way of conceptualizing this. Sometimes it's interesting though, because we have to think, well, who counts here as the non-state actor? And I'll get to that. But what I want to do, as someone whose job it is to actually investigate the spread of disinformation across platforms, some recent investigations I've done have raised really interesting questions about, as you said, platforms' ability, willingness, capability, desire to actually combat these problems. Last year, I worked with a colleague to uncover one of the largest influence campaigns in terms of monetary value that has been detected on Meta's platforms, right? This was an information campaign that used Meta's ad functionality to promote anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and in this case, anti-Qatar content. It was actually promoting conspiracy, that Qatar was behind an attempt to increase Muslim immigration to Europe to replace white people, right? It sounds absurd, and it genuinely is, and it was using AI-generated images. And eventually, I investigated this with a colleague. We documented this capacious campaign that wasn't just on Facebook, by the way. This campaign ran ads at CPAC in the US. It ran ads in Times Square. And it was also running billboards in Lebanon on a separate issue. We had some discussions with Facebook about this campaign, and they were investigating it too, based on the back of our investigations. And it was bizarre because we discovered that this campaign was, the Facebook alone, it was probably about $1.5 million spent on this campaign. And we didn't know who was behind it because we don't have that level of transparency. Yeah. But what was very interesting is that when Facebook eventually published one of their reports, now this was last year, when they were prior to the election of Trump, prior to them saying that they were going to scale back on their content moderation, they attributed, and we knew this campaign was being run by a content farm in Vietnam. So we're talking about deception supply chains, right? Yeah. Vietnam has a big industry where they do content farming, but also these paid-for propaganda campaigns. So we knew it was being run by Vietnam. We, along with another journalist at AFP, were looking into it. And we found the guy who was running this operation through our investigation. We asked the journalist to ask the guy why he was running this campaign. He said someone approached me on Telegram. They were anonymous. Now, we don't know if he was telling the truth or not, but again, it just shows, one, the ease of which these campaigns can operate. You could find a dude in Vietnam and say, hey, can you run this multi-million-dollar operation using hacked Facebook groups, reappropriate Facebook groups, to create a campaign that uses ad infrastructure to spread hate speech on a global scale? Exactly what that is. Yeah. And so we did all this. And when Facebook actually published their report, which came out after our report, we scooped them, they attributed the campaign to Vietnam. Now, obviously, we know Vietnam aren't behind this, right? So it raises a question, right? Did Facebook not know who was behind the campaign? Right. Did they know when they were hiding it? Or some third option that I can't think of. But what blows my mind is that they were taking millions of dollars for a campaign that was, a violation of human rights in terms of it as hate speech, propaganda, disinformation, making money off that, and not knowing who the payer was. Right. right? So you have this really bizarre situation, right? You actually have an entity that's taking money to facilitate the spread of this, right?
Yeah, all of that is very, very deeply terrifying, because you're speaking to basically an environment where with just an empty check that could be from cryptocurrency, any small group in the world can create a massive psychological effect that could affect the government of Qatar, could affect my government, can affect any sort of government, and that can create incidents that lead to extremism and violence. So I'll turn to you, Your Excellency. When you hear all of this, what is the best way that that Qatar is responding to it, and in terms of advice you might give to other governments, and how you go about addressing that sort of thing? What advice do you have? What is the best thing that governments should be doing and that they are doing right now?
It is very known that the cybersecurity, any attacks, is international. So it is not related to a country only. So I think the most important thing in this time is the cooperation between all the governments. It is in the government level and then in the technology provider level. So we always encourage the states or the countries to have more and more agreement on how to discover all of these type of attacks, which is something I have already, and sometimes things are happening, we don't know even about it. It is another country. So I think the cooperation and the communication between government will solve a lot of this part. Mm-hmm.
So I think that this is something that comes up a lot, this idea of multi-government information sharing, and also just more companies creating incentives and perhaps disincentives for companies to share information with a government entity that isn't connected to intellectual property, but that allows for Facebook to effectively respond to something without having to say it was Vietnam or any other company. So that's really key, and Qatar is in a great place to do it. But in terms of the United States, because we're a big target area for all of these things, and will increasingly be so in the future. Anjana, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that the Biden administration did, particularly in terms of pushing for enterprise-level cloud computing and environments where not so much in terms of disinformation, but in terms of the types of attacks we were talking about earlier, ransomware attacks, things like this, where there can be more transparency across the entire environment, where you have a hypervisor that can respond much more quickly to things, and as we saw with Ukraine, where you have an entire digital backup in the event of major catastrophic events, and it can also potentially help with attribution in terms of disinformation campaigns too. So talk a little bit about how the Biden administration pushed for larger adoption of enterprise-level cloud, and where you see that trend going now.
Yeah, we're talking, as we talk about non-state actors, the connotation often implies that we're talking about malicious actors. We're talking about criminal groups and hacker syndicates, and I think it's important to know that, not all non-state actors are adversaries. In fact, we should be leveraging non-state actors to be collaborators in our national security and our defense. You brought up the conflict in Ukraine, and I think that was such a source of motivation for my colleagues and I, particularly on the cyber security front, because as we know, that conflict began with a cyber attack led by state actors against an American commercial satellite company, which was quite unprecedented and changed the way we thought about the battlefield, so to speak, which is that private sector companies, big or small, now have to be prepared that they are building for the national interest, whether they intend to or not. And this was something that my colleagues and I at the White House spent a lot of time thinking about from a policy perspective, because it means that we can't only think about security as an incident response mechanism, but we need to actually shift left and go upstream as much as possible and really engage cybersecurity as a manufacturing imperative, as building better quality technology so that when and if an attack were to happen, it can withstand that. And so one of the policies that my team and I wrote was a policy called Back to the Building Blocks, which was really speaking to the technical community, the engineering community, but how do you actually manufacture and engineer things to be secure by design? And one of the things we introduced was the notion of just really advanced engineering techniques that can be thought about on day one so that you're not having to scramble at the very end when the attack inevitably has. And what we've seen in the years since that policy was written is that many private sector entities are now leaning into that and building internal strategies to adopt these ideas, which we're really delighted to see. And I think that kind of collaborative approach of building with the private sector hand in hand has proven to be very successful.
Oh, so that is very good news and very encouraging. But Adam, let me go to you. And there's a counter trend to that, which is less and less investment on behalf of governments in a lot of these core areas. You also see a changing of sort of policy priorities from the White House now moving away from for instance, Biden's AI policy, Biden's AI safety policy, and some other cybersecurity things. Do you see a potential danger that is growing right now based on government investment or public investment in some of these core areas? And how soon do you imagine it will be before we experience some sort of potential huge crisis? And then I'll go with Marc on the same question.
Well, certainly what we are seeing is governments and tech platforms focusing on things other than counterterrorism at the moment. And in terms of understanding what's happening on the internet, Marc and I were talking just now, one of the problems is we don't really know what is being shared on the internet. We don't know what the size of the problem is because it's so hard to analyze this at scale. It's very expensive for researchers to access social media platforms without breaching their terms of service. And it's very expensive to analyze this information. So fundamentally, observability of many of these online harms, including terrorist content, is very low. And that's a real problem. And we would argue that governments need to be investing more in understanding what's happening on the internet. That should be a national security imperative, but it's not. And this is quite confusing because clearly terrorism poses a significant threat throughout the world. Pretty much the number one threat in Europe at the moment is that posed by Islamic State or ISKP. And we know as well that a very large proportion of individuals who attack in Europe, in the UK, in the US and elsewhere are self-radicalized online. And we don't know really what's going on or why. We also don't know why such a large number of young people are being radicalized online. And if we don't know much about what's happening, I'm not sure we know what to do about it either. So we would say there needs to be significantly more investment in open source intelligence in this space. But it's deeply concerning because it would appear that governments are looking elsewhere right now.
Yeah, at the same time, though, for a free democratic society, that brings up certain pitfalls, right? Because what is one person's radical is another person's enthusiastic supporter, depending on sort of like where you rely on things. And there should be some sort of common sense, civic understanding of this is radical and this is terrorism and this is not. But I almost wonder if, on the basis of a dissolution of social coherence, extremism across a variety of sectors of society is becoming in many ways more palatable, and the chaos of the internet is a reflection of that. And that's something that troubles me because, as you point out, there's no natural remedy or solution to that.
Well, if I may, though, major terrorist organizations about whom there is no ambiguity, IS, Al-Qaeda, the Houthis, etc., are using social media platforms with impunity. There is so much content out there with a logo on, promoting the objectives of those groups. So I wholly agree with you that the challenge, central challenge with counterterrorism is ensuring how do we protect fundamental freedoms and human rights. That has to be paramount in how we do counterterrorism. What I'm talking about is obvious activity and content from the major terrorist organizations. The Houthis, for example, are selling weapons on X.
Yeah. That
it really is quite astonishing just how much there is online and just how little is being done about it.
Yeah, I want to take that same question to Marc in terms of, what you're seeing also in terms of the use of new and emerging technologies, not just social media, but potentially even open-facing, public-facing artificial intelligence by some of these non-state actors like the Houthis. But first, your thoughts on what we just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think to touch on a couple of things that Adam and Anjana said about these public-private partnerships, I mean, in terms of non-state actors, it's interesting to determine who might be a non-state actor. I mean, we talked a bit about the Houthis, we talked about, Islamic State, these are all important. But I think a really interesting example we've seen about emerging technologies, even used crudely in disinformation, is really interesting. So last year in the UK, we saw riots, some of the worst riots that the UK has ever seen in decades. And they were based on disinformation, right? So you had people setting fire and attacking hotels with migrants in, on the belief that a man in Southport who stabbed and killed 3 girls was a Muslim immigrant. He wasn't, right? But this was circulated rapidly on social media. One of the most influential accounts in spreading this narrative, right? Two of the most influential accounts. One would look like an anonymous engagement farm that had millions of followers, got millions of impressions, this is on X, using often crude AI-generated images that were very fundamentally racist and spreading false information about the nation of the attacker. Another was a content farm running out of Pakistan of a guy who ran these accounts that looked like news sites, but were basically clickbait engagement, right? And all using AI, AI-generated text, AI-generated images. And what role is AI playing here? Well, it's facilitating and making more efficient the spread of disinformation and misinformation. And what was very interesting about this particular case, which led to violence, because of the scale of the issue, even the UK police contacted me based on my analysis, because they were curious as to how to approach analyzing the data of this kind of disinformation and who was involved. But then it becomes very complicated. You can say, well, listen, lots of people spread the false information that you're interested in. You're selecting the most those with the most engagement, right? On the basis, and the people who weren't anonymous.
Right.
So it's like the low-hanging fruit, and you have this kind of very bizarre situation where you have the authorities trying to deal with the situation in an ad hoc way that seems absolutely ridiculous because of that social media platform essentially probably abandoning many of its former responsibilities due to the Elon Musk takeover. And I should add, we talk about non-state actors, Elon Musk would promote the account that I mentioned that was the anonymous account, spreading this disinformation and boosting its role, right? So is he a non-state actor spreading disinformation about the nature of the attacker? Does he constitute a non-state actor in this case? Spreading not necessarily terroristic information, but information that is part of a broader attempt to demonize and stigmatize immigrants and minority communities in Northern Europe, right? Which is, we are seeing the rise of right-wing terror. We have to acknowledge that too.
He's a wonderful man, and he's not at all vindictive.
Sorry, I should say that too. Yeah, I agree.
No. But you're actually the same question to you. How are you seeing some of these non-state groups beginning to use emerging technologies in a way that increases their capability and their scale?
Just getting back to the part of the private sector. Actually, what we are seeing in Qatar here, that the private sector, especially the major private sector companies, they are willing to share information even before the government sometimes knows about the attack or something. And we have a lot of cases that prove that they are willing to help our country to protect their information and all the infrastructure. So just to say that. Getting back to your question, of course, maybe the most used new technology is the AI, of course. The AI is always something that's rebuilt itself. So starting with ChatGPT and other program, now we are seeing a lot of tools similar to ChatGPT is used for the attack itself. Of course, the other thing is the deep fake for creating things that is not actual things, like making people talking or speaking or even announcing any fake information. And we have seen a lot of these, and usually it is used for the profit, not maybe for political part. Maybe it is there, but usually it is for profit things.
You've seen specific. thing. You've seen specific ones that were targeted against the government, use of deepfakes to drive campaigns.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really important because it speaks to a trend that's obviously just going to increase and speaks to all of these terrorist vectors that we've been talking about. So how does ISIS recruit? If you read some of the great New York Times reporting, kids in Indiana are recruited into ISIS because there's constant contact with them. They're constantly being engaged by someone that is able to be there for them and listen to them and give them a sense of belonging. That's kind of the first thing. And this is something that can be roboticized through large language models. But also, when we're talking about malware, for instance, the entire, especially the United States, a Fortune 500 bank runs a modern operating system. They're running the most up-to-date software, and they're pretty well protected against vulnerabilities that exist in the national vulnerabilities databases, like software problems that you can fix if you have a good CIO. Your local elementary school, your local municipal power entity possibly does not. And you can roboticize the finding of those vulnerabilities, not so much the writing of some fantastic wizard, zero-day alpha code, but just finding open ports where you can stick something and cause what was like a one-off ransomware attack against one school or one hospital, scale that across an entire state or even the country. And this is something that Rob Joyce, the former head of tailored access at the NSA, brought up to me as his biggest concern. So Anjana, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that in terms of where is this part of what informed the creation of the AI sort of Safety Institute and the AI policy that Biden was pushing for? And where did you leave a sense of AI safety, the risks versus the rewards, when the White House finally turned over?
Yeah, I might be the most techno-optimist on the panel, but my attitude and the administration's attitude is that we're very bullish on the opportunities that come with AI. We're not naive about the risks, and this is true not just for AI, but any dual-use technology. That anything that is valuable to the United States is going to be valuable to someone who wants to harm the United States, and that is just, I think, part of the policy-making process that you can't create a fault line and avoid the tough conversations. I think this attitude was reflected in the executive order, but I think most clearly in a less known piece of policy, which was the National Security Memorandum that was published towards the end of the administration, which was really focused on the use of AI from a national security context. And I think, what was perhaps not as clearly understood is that, that there was a clear desire from the administration to bring AI into government use, which I think is a very bullish signal. But the bar for the warfighter is high, and that the administration took the safety of our warfighters and the safety of our nation very seriously. And so what does it mean to have high assurance of our systems? And that term high assurance is something that the national security community has thought about for many, many years, and is a very nonpartisan way of thinking. And so I think the correct framing for any administration to think about AI is, yes, absolutely, we should be leading on technology. And what does it take to drive innovation and to make sure that we are the ones that are shaping the values of these technologies, but also being very aware of the weaponization of that. And I think everything that, that Marc, you mentioned and Adam mentioned is an example of what happens when we don't think about that. And so I think what we're seeing in this decade is that we're taking a much more collaborative approach. Even the fact that someone like myself ended up working in policy, I think coming from a technical background and being able to really understand what these technologies do, I think is a positive direction. And I think it's important that we don't look at this as in either or, but as an imperative part of our society.
Well, I think the optimism is great and very important, and we must all return to an optimistic center so that we can go out and do what we need to do. But Adam and Marc, to your mind, is this something, the effects of AI scaling up non-state actors, their capabilities, and what they present, is this something that you see governments adequately responding to at this moment, or is this just a big blind spot that's just growing by the day? I'll leave that for both of you.
So I would also say that I'm a tech optimist, and AI, in particular generative AI, creates a huge opportunity for us to analyze information at an unprecedented scale. And let's not forget, AI can be used to describe a whole range of technologies. We're talking about generative AI here. Yeah. At the moment, I would say that non-state actors, terrorists and others are ahead of the defenders. I don't think that's anything intrinsic about generative AI. That's more a matter of adoption of tech within government. What I would say first, though, is that governments, law enforcement, and Marc was alluding to police having reached out to him, is they often lack the fundamental tools and skills just to look at the internet, right? Let alone using generative AI. So I think if we can encourage governments to invest in that basic information infrastructure to understand what's happening on the internet, then large language models, generative AI should be hugely beneficial. So I think in the medium term, we should be have an advantage over our adversaries. However, my concern is the significant delay in adopting this technology. It's the same with platforms as well. The type of content that I've been discussing just now could be easily detected using very simple machine learning models or generative AI models, and it's not. Right. Why? We don't really know. Maybe it's because these platforms just don't want to deal with this content. Maybe they can't afford to do it. Maybe they like this content. Maybe they're profiting from this content. You would need to ask them. But the technology is already there to improve the online environment. It's just not being adopted by platforms. And for governments, it's also not being adopted. But hopefully that's just a matter of time.
Yeah. So, Marc, sorry, got to turn my thing back on. Why are the platforms not adopting the easy-to-use technologies that would prevent greater use of deep fakes and disinformation? Do they have some sort of selfish motivation? Like, what is it?
Platforms selfish? Never. I'll come to that in a second. I just want to piggyback off what Adam was saying, because it's absolutely true. And as someone who's a committed pessimist in all matters, including technology, but it is truthful. Inherently, AI can be used for good to be trivial. I mean, just as an example, in the work I do, I can look at, I can download a bunch of tweets with difficulty. I can use AI to categorize them instantly, almost, in something that would have taken me weeks before, right? That's great. However, just as an example, getting that information in the first place has become much more difficult. And this is a reflection of the political will. AI can be used for good in tackling cybersecurity issues, particularly disinformation. But the issue now is that we are seeing a worrying and alarming sort of, I suppose, renunciation of responsibility when it comes to that. We've just seen how the US, for example, federal government has cut grants specifically to researchers looking at disinformation, at deepfakes. And this is an ideological issue too, not just economic. This is about trying to say to, it's saying that disinformation has become politicized, and there's a lot of people now who think that accusing someone of disinformation is just because they're saying something that they disagree with. No, that's not true. It's false. We see the US State Department pressuring the UK regulatory, communications regulatory body for their Digital Services Act, which is designed to protect children from harmful information, allegedly because it goes against free speech. No, this is, again, these kind of regulations essentially are seen as non-tariff barriers against tech companies making more money because, coming to your question, ultimately these are seen to put handcuffs on American big tech firms, right? Content moderation teams have been removed or sort of downsized because ideologically they were accused of engaging in censorship. The reality is a lot of this is money, and we know that big tech have often lobbied, particularly in Brussels, against things like the digital services, these privacy laws and other laws, because they will hurt the bottom line of these companies. Right. And a lot of this easy to detect AI content is not marked. Facebook, for example, said that they would mark this AI stuff. If you go on Facebook now, go on Qatar Facebook, and it depends on your algorithm, but every third video is a crypto scam using AI. Yeah. Right? If you type Musk donations in your search, you will just be inundated with AI slop with false stories, right? Yeah, and you can see one of these images might be said, oh, this might be AI. You can see the identical image on another group with no marking. Yeah. So they don't have, I don't think they're taking the ability seriously. They're not rolling it out sufficiently. And I think the bottom line is probably money.
Yeah, yeah, I think that it is a fascinating and sort of disturbing trend that you point out, because I remember during the early days of the counter-ISIS fight, there was a Facebook-led a coalition to basically use some of the hashing techniques that had been used to stop the spread of child porn on the internet to hashtag ISIS propaganda to limit its scope. And now we're in a very different environment where, depending on the message that the disinformation seems to send, if it's disruptive enough, it's now seen as not only palatable but perhaps even useful to a variety of entities that now have a lot more influence, and they're not ISIS, but it's at the same time, it's exactly to your point, for someone that owns a social media network to go on that social media network and say that the Global Engagement Center, an entity of the State Department that was very specifically and very narrowly targeted to create narratives to counter specifically ISIS and then to counter Russian disinformation, was itself a propagator of disinformation, is bizarre and troubling and speaks to a much bigger problem that can easily be solved. But I want to go to Anjana on that, but also to you, Your Excellency. Where are you in Qatar beginning to use AI in any way in terms of cybersecurity or to understand the threat matrix a little bit differently?
In Qatar, actually, we know that AI is a must. We have to use it. We are encouraging our government and non-government to use the AI because it is a big benefit for them, and they have to catch up with the other party, which is the attacker. So if we don't improve our powerful in AI, they will be, as what's happening now, they are trying to attack us with the AI. So we have to use it. We encourage everyone to use it. We have initiated a guideline on how to use secure AI in our government. And there is a lot of, they have initiated a committee especially for the AI, so to improve the AI in our government in our country.
Okay. In the little time that we have left, I want to go to you, Anjana, and talk a little bit about, during the Biden administration, you guys tried to grapple with some of these, what at the time were seen as threats of bipartisan urgency. Republicans and Democrats, and I think you go to any parliamentary body around the world where you have a variety of parties, all agreed that foreign disinformation from an adversary was a threat, was bad, and should be pointed out and at least attributed. And there was a move to stand up a body to kind of do just that, because otherwise we're sort of defenseless. Like the nature of democracy is such that we're kind of defenseless against foreign disinformation campaigns that come from autocratic entities that you can't like return it back on them. Like Putin is invulnerable to a disinformation campaign because he is his own, if you will. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that experience as you tried to put forward, for instance, the board with Dina Jankowicz to monitor disinformation, and all of a sudden the political uproar that occurred around what just a few years ago was seen as an issue of bipartisan urgency. And I know that you came from the Democrat side, but what did you learn from that about kind of how a free society that loves free expression, are we innately vulnerable to disinformation campaigns just because of our structure? Or what was your biggest takeaway from that?
You know, I joke that I've become more apolitical since joining and leaving the White House. You know, I think at the end of the day, these issues should be nonpartisan.
Right.
The problems that we're facing as a nation and as a collective globe are so hard that we don't have time to trivialize them through politics. And I think, what my team and I really held as a first principle in our work was to be as technical in our work as possible. And by that I mean really get to the crux of what is the root underpinning it. And, in fact, my colleague and I wrote a piece in Defense One for GSF this week.
Oh, that's right. Please read it on Defense One. It's a fantastic piece, by the way.
That actually talks a bit about one of the things we think is really important, which is, as we're seeing AI become part of the future of warfare, it is not a debate of whether or not we should do it. It's here. Like, this is the world we live in. And so the question around who wins that arms race, so to speak, is not just about whoever builds the smartest system or the fastest decision system. It's who is building these systems that are working the way they're supposed to, whether that's, an autonomous drone or our energy grid or our semiconductors. Like, we want to make sure that the technologies we're building work the way they're supposed to, because if we don't understand that, then our adversary can weaponize it, regardless of who that adversary is. And to be a little on the wonky side, what we propose is that there's kind of this, a new tool that we need in our arsenal that needs to be more rigorous than the traditional kind of testing mechanisms we have, and that we need to actually become really technical and introduce the notion of the math proof to prove correctness of our systems. And this is a good way to neuter the partisan bite, because most people, when you start talking about math proofs, they will conveniently find a reason to leave the conversation and find something else to do. But I jokes aside, I think this is a perfect example of how do we get past the politics of these really hard problems, and that's often that, especially when we talk about cybersecurity, these are some of the hardest scientific and technical problems that we're facing, and we need to get back to serious conversation and really make sure that we're engaging people of all sides of the political aisle to build and secure these systems for the decades to come.
Yeah, that is very optimistic, and I like this idea that if we can find bipartisan consensus to actually build the tools that will prevent misuse by non-state actors of the internet, either to create or foment violent extremism through disinformation or to lock up computers in ransomware or for anything else. If the technical solutions are there, there's bipartisan support for them, it is inevitable that they will reach utilization. Let's hope. I think that's a very optimistic, it's a wonderful thing to focus on, is an optimistic thing to focus on. So in the last minute or so, I wonder if I could just go down the aisle and in maybe a sentence or two, if you could tell the governments, not necessarily your own government, but the governments around the world that are in most of need of hearing it, one thing that they should do right now to improve their cybersecurity posture from non-state actors, what would be the one thing you would recommend? Right, we only have 41 seconds. The one.
I will say two things: international cooperation and awareness. Awareness for all your citizens. That's the most two things that we have to consider it with.
Okay.
Cyberspace is different than the other battle domains in the sense that it is infinitely large and it's sprawling, and it can be very overwhelming if you're a policymaker or government official tasked with defending it. And so my piece of advice is to go back to the building blocks and make sure you're securing the foundation and then build upwards from there.
Mine is don't defund disinformation research.
And I would say invest significantly more time into understanding how terrorists are using the internet, and then secondly, creating public-private partnerships to share that information with researchers.
Well, there you go. We did your job for you. So please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful conversation today. Really appreciate you guys.